Item: SCP-753. Object Class: Safe. Special Containment Procedures: SCP-753 is currently contained at Sector 28. Located on SCP-753 is to be contained in a 6 m x 6 m holding cell, monitored by surveillance cameras at all times. SCP-753 is to be provided with 5 liters of each primary color of paint each day, along with 24 standard painting canvases. All paintings created by SCP-753 are to be recorded by research staff. In the event that SCP-753 attempts to destroy itself, security personnel are to restrain SCP-753 and await further orders from research staff present. Description: SCP-753 is a highly advanced automaton approximately 10 centimeters across, 6 centimeters wide and 8 centimeters tall. SCP-753 possesses two pincer-like limbs protruding from its main circular body, which it uses to slowly move itself across the ground. This is likely due to SCP-753's locomotive functions having been damaged at an unknown point in its history. At the center of SCP-753's body is a red sensory organ similar in structure to that of the human eye. SCP-753's eye appears to be organic, but it is likely artificially produced. This eye is also damaged, leaving SCP-753 partially blind. A Marshall, Carter and Dark Limited logo has been engraved on SCP-753's back. Interior analysis of SCP-753 shows that it moves using a rudimentary nervous system, coordinated by an extremely small spherical brain. Above SCP-753's body is a small receiver, the purpose of which is currently unknown. SCP-753 appears ignorant of its surroundings, and does not recognize the presence of personnel. SCP-753's primary purpose appears to be the creation of paintings. Paintings produced by SCP-753 are highly realistic and often do not correspond to real locations. Recently, paintings created by SCP-753 have mostly involved, in some way, SCP-753's death. SCP-753 was initially returned to Marshall, Carter and Dark Limited by one of their clients, who complained that it was broken. A Foundation mole within the organization was able to retrieve SCP-753 before incineration. SCP-753 usually produces one painting per hour. When SCP-753 is not provided with adequate paint or painting canvas, it appears to enter a dormant state, shutting down for a minimum time length of one week. As this heavily impedes research, SCP-753 is to be kept stocked with paint and canvases at all times. SCP-753 does not appear to be concerned about completed paintings, and generally ignores them after they are finished.